Good day and welcome to the Tech and Space Leader Show, where we learn lessons from leaders of the next frontier. I am your host, Lisa Dreher, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest for today, Matthew Shouppe. He is a senior associate at Booz Allen for their space sector. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thank you, Lisa, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for making time to be here. Perhaps we can start by having you give a little bit of background on yourself and Booz Allen's space sector.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So I'll start back from the beginning. My background academically was in engineering and physics. Did my bachelor's in physics from the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and then I did my master's in engineering physics from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in 2010. Then I moved up to the Washington, D.C. area where I've been since then. And so for about the past 14, 15 years, I've been working in the space industry, specifically with companies who are contributing to software and applications related to flying satellites and performing space mission operations, flying spacecraft safely, tracking space debris. And then most recently, I joined Booz Allen Hamilton back in April of this year. So I've been there about 6 months. And I'm on a team. I'm on our space sector team, and in particular, I'm on a unique team that handles a number of commercial engagements as opposed to kind of the federal contracts that we support for the U.S. government. So my team at Booz Allen, we manage a number of partnerships with other commercial space companies to collaborate with them on various opportunities, as well as managing several internally funded research and development projects about developing capabilities in-house that we want to launch within the industry and partner with other companies on.
Great. Okay, so I really want to jump into understanding this concept of space domain awareness. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the keys to addressing the challenges with this specific area of the space industry.
Sure. So space domain awareness has been a very hot topic for the past several years, ever since the DoD introduced that term into the sort of official vernacular. But it essentially means gathering critical information and context around what's happening in orbit right now, or what's may happen tomorrow or next week, and combining that with, for example, the more traditional space situational awareness data, which is the orbits of satellites and space debris, and to be able to track and maintain custody. And we want to fuse those things together as best as we can to make intelligent decisions at operational timescales. So that's kind of the goal of SDA in a nutshell. It has a lot of moving pieces to it. It involves hardware and software and resources on the ground and in orbit and all sorts of things. But the various areas, like for example at Booz Allen, that we're focusing on is primarily on the software side of things and algorithms, and how we can apply things like artificial intelligence and machine learning to tackle what have traditionally been critical sort of challenges for space domain awareness, and how can we kind of remove some of those bottlenecks. One example of that is being able to take SDA related data, for example, and to be able to process it or make sense of it. We've heard from multiple sources, including some folks in the U.S. government, that there's an abundance of data available, but there's not always quality data analytics or the ability to make sense of all the data that you have. It's actually not even that uncommon for operational systems to have a mountain of data, but only to be able to actually use a small fraction of it, due to a number of resources related to downlinks from satellites or computing capabilities taking too long because they're run on old mainframe systems and they're not deployed in cloud architectures and running on HPC environments and that sort of thing. So those are some of the challenges that we are working on at Booz Allen, to develop those capabilities, get them to field, and try to address some of those problems.
So let's dig into that a little bit further. You mentioned AI. What role will AI play in kind of helping, I guess, maybe solve some of these challenges of having all of this data, but not really being able to get, I guess, conclusions out of that data?
Yeah, and I'll preface by saying I was fairly new to the AI side of things when I joined Booz 6 months ago. I'd used ChatGPT a few times, but that was kind of it. But Booz Allen is an enormous, they're a bit of a powerhouse in the AI world. They actually have an interesting metric that Booz Allen is the largest provider of AI-based solutions to the U.S. government, period. That's not an internal metric. That's, I think, from a Dell Tech report released a few months ago. So that spans across civil and intelligence and DoD customers across not just the space sector, but all kinds of different industries supporting the government. But in our case, looking at how we can use AI to advance some technologies, I'll give you a couple examples of things that we worked on. One in particular, we highlighted a few months ago. We actually deployed, to our knowledge, what was the first large language model in space. This was back in July of this year. We have a partnership with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, who has some pretty significant computing hardware on board the ISS National Laboratory, where you can perform science experiments, and it's a good way to get the public and academia, several types of companies and institutions involved in being able to do experiments on the ISS. So we developed a way to essentially take a large language model and deploy it on board that computing resource on board the space station, to allow, as a proof of concept, to essentially allow astronauts to be able to make queries in that ChatGPT style fashion for using documentation such as PDFs or instruction manuals for equipment on board the space station, that sort of thing, and let them actually go and ask a question, and then our LLM will go figure out which resource it needs to go look for and to learn that, and then be able to answer the questions for it. So that was a really cool thing that we were all very excited about back earlier this year, this summer. Another example, kind of more in the space domain awareness side of things, is we just published a paper and gave a presentation at the recent AMOS conference, which is the kind of predominant SSA, SDA conference in the world in Maui in September of each year. And one recent project that we have, and this is one of our internally funded research and development projects, is one key aspect of space domain awareness is simply to be able to track and see things in orbit. That's kind of SSA and SDA. But we don't do too much space-based observations yet. And one bottleneck of those who want to do that is traditionally that you have to, say, if you have a satellite with a telescope or a camera on board, for example, and you want to image the starry background and see if you detect any objects in orbit. Well, you could do that, but then the traditional way to do that would be to downlink all of the raw data that you took from that image, like really large files, and then do the processing of the imagery on the ground to find the satellite, make a usable data product out of that sort of thing. What we are developing now is a set of algorithms that you can actually run on board the satellite itself, such that it will autonomously do that same function on board, where it will take the image, it will process the image and compress it appropriately. It'll figure out if there's a satellite in the field of view, and there's a number of other things downstream of that it will be able to do as well. And then when you come time to downlink the data through your ground station, you only need to downlink the final product there, not the raw data. So I think that one area where AI is going to be incredibly useful moving forward is automating lots of different types of processes and operations on orbit, because the amount of hardware and software compute resources on orbit will continue to go up. That seems to be a trend lately. And with that comes a lot of automation and the ability to do high performance computing, even with limited computational resources, right? Because some of these satellites are very small. You don't have a rack of servers up there. It might just be a 3U CubeSat, and you have a third of that, and you need to cram as much compute resources in there as you can. So we try to work with those sorts of constraints to make realistic solutions that can run on board the appropriate platforms.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so that kind of begs the question of, so space domain awareness and space traffic management, what role both of those will play in the sustainability of space?
Sure. Yeah. So SDA and STM are they're quite different, but yet they're very closely related, right? SDA is traditionally thought of as kind of has a defense type of feel to it, like intelligence gathering about what's that non-cooperative satellite doing, over there? Can we still track it? Did it maneuver somewhere? is there a launch coming up tomorrow from this other country, that sort of thing. And then space traffic management is essentially like avoiding collisions of things on orbit. But they both play very heavily into the sustainability topic. Sustainability probably means different things to different people, but I take the I think the most obvious interpretation of that, first and foremost, which is just don't make a mess in orbit. We want to avoid and essentially either reduce or completely eliminate as much as possible debris generating events in orbit, such that we can continue to use the orbital environment for many years and decades to come. And for space traffic management, there can be collisions if two satellites collide together, as happened in 2009 with the famous Cosmos Iridium collision that generated a few thousand pieces of debris, many of which are still up in orbit. But also on the SDA side, it gets into activities performed by certain countries, like an ASAT test, if you're familiar with that. It stands for anti-satellite test. It's essentially where a government, and this has happened dozens of times throughout the space age, but not so much in the past 10 or 15 years. There's been 2 or 3 examples, but they have a lot more scrutiny on them now that space is quite crowded. It didn't used to be, but like in November 2021, Russia launched a ground-based missile and took out one of their own defunct satellites on purpose. They hit it, it exploded, and it made, I think, 1,500 or 2,000 pieces of debris, which is pretty wild because even that own act endangered their own cosmonauts aboard the International Space Station. So it's kind of a crazy world out there. There are some factors that may be beyond our control a little bit there as far as what certain foreign actors do. On the STM side, there is a real need for efficient and preferably autonomous ways to communicate with one another. That's kind of one of the biggest hindrances right now, honestly. It sounds surprising, but if there's not a huge technical barrier to space traffic management in terms of tracking the objects and assessing where a collision might happen and maneuvering out of the way. But when you have, let's say, 2 different satellite operators that are operating in different countries, they speak different languages, their operating schedules are 12 hours apart, and they've never talked to one another before. They don't have their contact information or anything like that. And then they get a conjunction alert that says, hey, you might hit this satellite in 12 hours. And they have to scramble, try to call somebody manually on the phone. Like, there haven't been really great mechanisms yet to facilitate that. And it'll be interesting to watch that because now China has just started launching their first mega constellation of a few thousand satellites. They put a few dozen up so far to it's like their version of Starlink, essentially, broadband internet access. So that'll require a lot of coordination from them that we typically haven't seen much of in the past. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
So that brings up a question, which you may have just answered, which is, do you think we're truly ready to manage this kind of coming orbital traffic congestion that is really coming our way? And I guess what else is missing? I mean, you kind of already touched on this, but what else is missing in that whole scheme to be able to successfully manage that congestion?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed answer. In some ways, when we say that could be different things, but as a global space community, we have a pretty good foundation to that already to be able to track most of the objects, the lethal sized objects in orbit. There is a gap though. Right now, traditional methods from government or commercial sensors, we can still only really track down to about objects that are about 10 centimeters in size across. Anything that's lower than that, it becomes too difficult to kind of maintain custody on or issue conjunction alerts on. But yet there are hundreds of thousands of pieces of stuff in that size bin that we know are up there. So that's a bit scary. So we need to just continue doing a better job of doing the job of developing next generation technologies to be able to track smaller and smaller size, for example, debris fragments, to make those conjunction alerts. And then, there's the communication aspect that we just touched on, where those mechanisms for communication are still not really fleshed out yet. There is international collaboration at some levels. So I do think there is some progress there, but I think there's a ways to go. And so, I think time will tell. I know companies like SpaceX and Starlink get a lot of the attention from the media because of the size of their constellation, but I've worked with them in the past, and they have one of the most robust, effective collision avoidance, operational systems that I've seen. It's really stellar. I personally think the next collision in orbit is probably going to be two random defunct old satellites that basically the world kind of forgot about, that have been lingering around up there for decades. One of them might be from the US government. It's probably the US, Russia, or China. That's who has most of the defunct stuff in orbit right now. And there's probably going to be an accidental collision that'll create a bunch of debris. And so, yeah, you want to track that, and then add it to the space catalog, and then do conjunction alerts and do your risk mitigation maneuvers. It's a process. But hopefully, we can minimize that. There are techniques for that, for debris outside of just collision avoidance. There's whole topics about debris mitigation and remediation. There's like the subject of active debris removal, and figuring out which defunct objects on orbit pose the greatest risk to hitting something, and then can someone pay to go like deorbit that, and that's a whole separate topic. But so it's pretty multifaceted. So I think the answer is a bit mixed. I think we're in a pretty good spot, but there are certainly gaps to fill there that we need to continue working on.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit, although I think this is kind of an offshoot, and that is, what is the role that software and cloud computing are going to be playing in, I guess, maintaining that safe orbital environment?
Yeah, this is one area where I think we've seen over the past several years an enormous sort of shift towards different architectural makeup of systems. The legacy way of doing things was, if you want to fly a satellite, you have your ground system, which has like lots of the software, like flight dynamics and command and control and some other things on the ground, and that's basically where all the computation happened. And oftentimes in the locally in that facility on dedicated physical computers, and a lot of the computations associated with space missions they're very computationally intense. They're not instant. They can take some. You might want to run some analyses about risk tolerance on for a conjunction event coming up, or even processing some of your own data back on the ground. These things can take a lot of compute resources, and so I know you and others are aware of this, but there's been an enormous shift over the past few years to switching to cloud-based environments that are flexible and will let you scale up or down the levels of compute resources you need on demand, essentially. And that's been enormously effective. We also have things like GPUs now that are really excellent at certain types of computational processes, including the applications of AI. Right. So, and that's another area that, circling back to the start of the conversation here, and for example, whether that happens on the ground or in orbit, you can have GPU type hardware that can do lots of different AI applications, like have neural networks and these detection algorithms that can do certain things, and in ways that you just really couldn't do with traditional, CPU type applications. So that's one area where I think we will only continue to see an enormous amount of growth, probably at a nonlinear rate. And I think it will eventually move towards more and more things happening on board satellites, and it will let operators do as much as they can on board the satellite, so that they can minimize the amount of post-processing that needs to happen on the ground there. So I think that's a trend we're going to see continuing to increase.
Okay, so I guess that leads into my final question, which is really, if you were to make one prediction about the future of this kind of space environment we've been talking about, what would that prediction be?
I would say, actually fairly close to the last question. I would say that we will continue to see a rise in the applications of onboard computing and AI and machine learning as applied to lots of different problem sets in the space sector, for SSA, for SDA, for human space exploration. There's so many different applications for it. As that's become such a big enabler. Essentially a whole new way to compute things in ways that we couldn't do before. And I do think that we will see a trend towards more autonomy happening on board satellites, not just to operate the payloads, but even potentially doing, propulsive maneuvers. And, circling back to the SpaceX example from earlier, they're one of the only ones that are doing that now already. They have a system on board where the Starlink satellites can essentially, they upload the conjunction alert information, and then the satellites themselves make the determination whether or not they need to maneuver out of the way. So I think others are going to follow suit after that. And I think we're going to see a lot of really neat use cases of compute resources deployed at the edge in orbit to just maximize the utility of operations there. And I think we're also going to continue to see a lot of success from the commercial space sector in developing, software buses and propulsion systems and payloads that can work with those capabilities and ultimately help us get capabilities to orbit faster than we have in the past.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So if someone wanted to learn more about Booz Allen's space sector practice, what should they do?
Yeah, I mean, please. I don't know if my contact information is part of the kind of credits here, but viewers are welcome to reach out to me. They can also visit Booz Allen's website. We have a space page. I don't have the exact URL on hand, but it's pretty easy to find. And you can get an idea of the various elements that we are working on in our space sector at Booz Allen, including some of the research projects that we mentioned here today.
Excellent. You are a speaker on this session, so folks watching this on LinkedIn are able to see your profile. So
Perfect.
They should be able to connect with you there, and like you said, can visit the Booz Allen's website. So thank you so much, Matthew, for making time to be here today. A really fascinating topic, and boy, we've barely scratched the surface.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Lisa. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And I do want to take a moment to thank GuideForce for hosting these sessions. To learn more about GuideForce, you can visit guideforce.com. And we'll see you next time on the Tech and Space Leaders Show.